unique story here because you're looking at something of a historical lens of female serial killers and female perpetrated serial homicide, and sort of looking at that culture, that psychopathology, and of course that investigation you can begin to piece together of how we look at the death penalty. Was that particularly one in which was a good fit? So we look at this. Eileen was one of the few women to actually receive the death penalty within the United States. So very interesting when we're looking at that gender piece of it. Look at it from the race perspective as well. How many are African American? How many are white? Always sort of interesting to look at. That definition of behavior as deviant, again, remember, varies across societies, groups, and even time periods, right? The emergence of the hate crime legislation in the U.S. is an example of this. Prior to this time, prior to hate crime sort of being put into law, you began to see very high amounts of hate crime that began to exist. So let me say this. I want to caution you in needing to interpret official crime statistics because those reactions of authorities are influenced by social class of that particular offender. Those crime statistics are a human creation, produced within a very specific social and political context for some particular purpose. So understand that police discretion sort of decides on whether or not to arrest somebody or to ignore a situation. Think about it. If you get pulled over for driving really fast, right, you're going to get a speeding ticket. That's up to that police officer as to whether or not they're going to just give you a fine or they're going to give you just a warning. It's a routine part of that police work. So those crime statistics that we look at reflect that and a lot of other biases that exist. And so that police officer, again, might not be, maybe there's other components that we don't realize that police officer has biases towards other individuals or vice versa. Race, gender, age. All these components are so important when we begin to dissect something as simple as crime and deviance. Here's a slide. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but this is Ted Bundy. He was on trial in Miami for killing 2 women, both college students. He has a very long history of engaging in serial killing. But what's so interesting is that when you look at serial killers, right, you're going to find that a large amount of these individuals are highly charismatic, right? You're going to start to see that these individuals have some type of means. In this case, he was a lawyer at a good portion of his life. But and when you look at that image, would you even consider him one of the most notorious criminals of the 20th century to exist, right? So when we look at this stuff, and he came from a very prominent family, right? He ended up, his dad, I believe, was an Air Force veteran, and his mother, I'm trying to remember here, but she also was quite prominent as well, right? Sort of grew up in Vermont, sort of, now he was an illegitimate child, but he wanted to, you began to see a much darker side of him as well, to his character begin to emerge. And so I think that's really important for us to look at when you begin to dissect something as far as deviance, as to how that individual, what was their childhood like? Were they caught early on? Were they let go? These are all sort of questions that you guys can look at within your paper. What did that trial look like? Were they convicted of certain things, or were they given lesser offenses? What did that offense look like? What was their punishment or their sanction look like as well? These are all really good questions for us to begin to dissect. One of the other things that I want us to talk about briefly is that there's something called medicalization of deviance. This is the view that deviance is a symptom and that there's some underlying illness that needs to be treated by physicians. There's a gentleman named Thomas Sazas who argues that mental illness is simply a problem behavior. Some forms of mental illnesses have some type of organic causes, like depression caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, while others are necessarily more responses to troubles within various coping devices. Sazas' analysis suggests that there are social experiences and not some illnesses of the mind that underlie those bizarre behaviors. So being mentally ill can sometimes lead to other problems like homelessness, but being homeless can lead to unusual and unacceptable ways of thinking that are defined by the wider society as mental illnesses. So when we look at deviance, it's really important for us to understand that a lot of times when somebody says, oh, that person's a criminal, there must be something wrong with them, they tend to try to label them with some type of mental illness. Yes, there are a lot of times where these two go hand in hand, but it's something that I think we need to be mindful of. I think in our society, we like to diagnose people. We like to believe that there is something within that label that helps us to understand that there's something wrong in that disapproved behavior, in a sense. This particular gentleman is called the scary guy. He goes across the country to various schools where he sort of promotes that acceptance and awareness and love and understanding within that. So sort of interesting. With deviance, we know that this is inevitable, right? One measure of a society is how it treats its deviants. We have to understand this from a much larger macro level. How are we going to protect people from deviant behaviors that are harmful to their welfare, to tolerate those that are not, and to sort of develop those systems of a fair treatment for deviants? So we need to look at, I think a lot of times people argue as one of the biggest political and social concerns is, what kind of system is in place for those that are deviant? Are they getting fair treatment? We hear some of those outlier stories of those individuals that were imprisoned unjustly as a result. And why did that system fail them, in a sense? So it's really interesting when we begin to look at those experiences and begin to look at how our system's designed and how are there biases in place when we do. All right, that wraps up chapter 6. If you guys have questions, we're going to review them probably later in the end of the week. But I want to make sure that you guys sort of get the full gist of chapter 6. We're going to watch a movie, The Crips and the Bloods, to sort of tie everything together. Okay, we'll talk about questions later on. Thanks.